Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 6th of April of 2023. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to start with Bakhmut. According to the Russian sources map, we see that the Russians have established control over the almost entire central part. There are just few areas that still remain under Ukrainian control. This is the railroad station on the north, this is the prison in the center of this area, this is the bus station, and this is the territory that located on the north of this stadium. According to the Western sources map, we see almost the same progress, but even less from the Ukrainian side. The Russians have almost established control over entire area, as you can see. Furthermore, some Russian sources are saying that as a result of clashes in this area, the Russians also established control over the railroad station, over this part that located in the central part of Bakhmut. And the Russians are currently in the vicinity of the prison in this area. So now we can say that the chapter of battle for central part of Bakhmut has ended, and now we are like at the beginning of the next episode, I believe the final episode of battle for Bakhmut for its western part. The Russian sources map are saying that the Russians developed their bridgehead from the north significantly. As you can see, they have a progress, and they have a very powerful and stable bridgehead that they're trying to develop to the south. Also, the Russians have bridgehead on the south area near the airport, near the MiG-17 statue, but the Russians stopped in this area and they can't proceed, they can't develop their bridgehead from the south because of the fact that Ukrainians accumulated a lot of significant number of their forces, and they tried to hold this Tchaikovsky Street, and they tried to hold the communication and supply roads that connects Bakhmut through these fields with Chasov Yar and the mainland. So when talking about the Western source map, we see that the Russians are stopped from the south, they can't move further, they're blocked, but the Russians developed their offensive operation from the north. So the Russians continue the tactic of pushing the Ukrainians. They are not encircling them, but they're pushing them. During the previous day, the Russians made few attempts to attack in direction of Bogdanovka and in direction of Grigorievka. Furthermore, some Ukrainian sources are saying that as a result of those attacks, the Russians managed to enter the outskirts of Bogdanovka, and now their controls, let's say, the northeastern part of Bogdanovka. And some sources are saying that the Russians also managed to get as close as possible to Grigorievka, and they're like right in front of this village. So by these attacks, the Russians can complete the encirclement of Bakhmut, and then they can cut the last supply and support roads of Bakhmut, and this town might appear in encirclement. I'll remind you that there are still around 15,000 of Ukrainians, and if the Russians are able to succeed in Grigorievka and Bogdanovka, these forces will be encircled, and they will know, and they won't have any possibilities to step back from this area. This about Bakhmut. Now let's talk about other updates on the ground, and first let's start from the north. During the day, the Ukrainians special forces tried to cross the Russian border one more time in Bryansk area. So this is the fourth or maybe fifth time in a row when the Ukrainians are trying to do this. If you remember, yesterday we received a piece of news that Ukrainians were trying to cross the border with the airplane, and later the investigators told us that there was a bomb on this airplane, but that airplane was shut down by the Russians and the pilot was captured. Today the Russians are saying that they also managed to defeat the Ukrainians. There's a group of 15 soldiers who were trying to cross. They were attacked by artillery, and after having some damage, they were forced to step back. Now we are going to the Kupiansk and Liman front line. As you can see, there are no changes, that's just the artillery duels, but as you can see, the number of artillery duels are very heavy. The weather becomes better, and the Russians are saying that Ukrainians have activated in this area, and now they're moving more and more tanks and artillery systems to the combat line, and now the Ukrainians also started attacking the Russians from their side. When talking about Avdiivka, today the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation gave us a very interesting piece of news from this area. They're saying that the Russians were trying to, during the previous 24 hours, on the 5th of April to be more precise, the Russians were attacking in direction of Toninka and Severna, trying to get new checkpoints and new trenches of the Ukrainian side. And they were attacking heavily the trenches that located on the south of Severna, These trenches was under protection, under defense of 53rd Mechanized Brigade. That brigade was some forces of that brigade were located in these trenches, and under very heavy fire, those forces, there were around 14 soldiers, were forced to surrender. They called the Russians using the radio and asked them to provide them a safe corridor for evacuation and to surrender. The Russians stopped any clashes, any artillery duels in this area, and they evacuated those 14 soldiers, let's say in direction of Vodyane. But it was a very late night, and the Russians didn't risk by moving these forces from Vodyane, let's say from this front line, to the mainland in direction of Donetsk. So that's why the Russians took a decision to hold these 14 soldiers in some trenches in this area, trying to wait until morning comes. The Russians are saying that situation was discovered by the Ukrainian commanders, and they took a decision to attack their own Ukrainian forces with artillery. The Russians are saying that Ukrainians used around 300 mines when attacking the trenches where their own 14 soldiers were located, and as a result of attack, friendly fire from the Ukrainian side, those 14 soldiers were killed. Now let's talk about South Donetsk and Ugledar area. As you can see, there are very heavy clashes as well. There are very heavy artillery duels in this area, but without any changes on the ground. The Russians are saying that and this is not the first update during this week. The Russians, it may be the second or third update in a row when the Russians were saying that Ukrainians made another attempt to storm Russian position in vicinity of Mykolaiv. So as you can see, the situation have completely changed in opposite way, and now the Ukrainians are trying to storm the Russians on the north of Mykolaiv, trying to push the Russians back. But all those attempts of storm operation were repulsed by the Russians, and the Russians are saying that as a result of clashes on the front line from Zaporozhye to South Donetsk area, the Ukrainians lost 55 soldiers, 65 soldiers, 5 armored vehicles, and 2 artillery systems. Furthermore, the Russians are saying that during the previous 24 hours, during all those attacks, there was a first confirmed case of destroyed armored vehicle, Bradley armored vehicle. So that was the first case, and exactly the South Donetsk and Zaporozhye area is the area where the Ukrainians were using this type of units. The Russians are saying that they continue artillery duels in Kherson front line. The Ukrainians lost 20 soldiers, 2 armored vehicles, and 1 artillery system Akatsiya on this front line. Now let's talk, there are a lot of changes on the deployment map, and we need to discuss them because they're very important. And first let's start with the north, and the thing is that the Russians, the deployment map is saying that Ukrainians moved their 3rd Tank Brigade to the border with Belgorod and Belgorod region. So this is a very interesting and very fresh update, and this update gives a lot of thoughts and a lot of things to discuss. For example, now, what is the reason of deployment of the 3rd Tank Brigade in this area? There are at least few possible things. Maybe the Ukrainians are planning to reinforce their positions on the Kupiansk and Liman front line for further and final attack in direction of Svatovo. Let's say this attack. This is the first reason why the Ukrainians deployed this brigade in this area. And the second solution, and I believe that this is much more smarter solution in comparison with the attack in direction of Svatovo, is to attack the territory of Russian Federation in direction of 2 towns like Uzarova and Vailuki. As you can see, this is like a very powerful, a very important logistic hub in this area that the Russians using the railroad to supply and support LPR, Starobilsk, and the entire LPR Republic. So this is a smarter solution, and maybe that deployment of that tank brigade in this area is exactly for these purposes. A lot of updates on deployment map are coming from Bakhmut area. The Ukrainians have deployed their 17th Tank Brigade right behind Grigoriev, exactly the area that we discussed, that the Russians got the outskirts of this town. Furthermore, the Western sources are saying that they have deployed 57th Motorized Brigade in direction of Grigoriev as well. Maybe the Russians achieved success during exactly the rotation process, but from the other side, I see that deployment of Tank Brigade and Motorized Brigade in this area was done just with one purpose: not to allow the Russians to penetrate and to break this through this area, and not to give them opportunity to establish bridgehead on the north of Chasov Yar. Another interesting things are coming from the south. We discussed that a few days ago the Ukrainians deployed their 12 separate tank brigades, so for now it's like 2 fresh tank brigades in this area. Furthermore, the Ukrainians are saying that they also deployed 127th Territory Defense Brigade between, let's say, Bakhmut and the road in direction of Slavyansk. So this is also very interesting update. Very interesting updates on deployment map are coming from Kupiansk-Liman front line. As you can see, at least we used to see a lot of brigades in the Serebryanka forest, but the Russians start using their new flamethrower system, and using them, the Russians managed to deal a lot of damage to the Ukrainians in this area. So, and as you can see, according to this map, there are no more brigades, no more forces in this forest. I believe that there are some scouts, maybe commandos, some checkpoints, but there are no more forces that Ukrainians were planning to use to storm Kremenaya. They was defeated in this forest. We discussed a lot of losses that during the previous months. There were a lot of losses from the Ukrainian side, and they took a decision to move everything and to replace them with 58's motorized brigade that now their job like maybe to and as you can see, this brigade is located right on the way in direction of Yampol, so to prevent any penetration in this area and the encirclement of Siversk group. So furthermore, another interesting updates are coming from Avdiivka. The deployment map says that the Ukrainians moved their 71st Jager Brigade in direction of Novobakhmutovka. If you remember, we discussed this situation that Ukrainians managed to accumulate a very powerful fist in this area. Also, the Russians are saying that during the previous 24 hours they managed to attack and destroy the headquarters of 110th Brigade in this area, and this brigade is responsible for the bridgehead that located on the north of Krasnogorovka and on the west from Novobakhmutovka. So maybe the Russians are planning to continue and to restart and to reload this operation and to continue encirclement of Avdiivka. So as you can see, there are a lot of events on the front lines, a lot of very interesting updates. Something great and very big is going to happen within the next few days or weeks. Anyway, before the beginning of May, we are going to see maybe even completely different picture in comparison with this. But for now, we see what we see and we have what we have. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in Ukraine. Thank you for your watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.